I want to be honest about something before I start. I wasn't trying to be a hero that day. I wasn't trying to make history or build bridges between species or any of that stuff they put in the recruitment pamphlets. I was tired, my boots were giving me blisters on both heels, and I just finished a 14-hour patrol shift that included 3 noise complaints from the Velhari Merchant Quarter, 1 near altercation at the Docking Bay Customs checkpoint, and a 2-hour standoff with a Grenin cargo captain who refused to believe his vessels' atmospheric vents were violating station code. I was hungry, that's the whole truth of it. I was hungry, and Level 9 had the cheapest hot food on the station. That's where this whole thing started. Level 9 wasn't the kind of place you'd read about in the station tourism brochures. Those were all about Level 12, which was the diplomatic plaza with the rotating holographic murals and the zero-G observation lounge. Or Level 3, with its climate-controlled promenade and the little park dome where they'd managed to grow actual grass. Level 9 was none of that. Level 9 was where the station actually lived. It was a lower transit corridor, one of the older sections, built during the second phase of Meridian's construction when they were still figuring out what the station needed to be instead of what they hoped it would look like. The ceiling was lower than the diplomatic levels, maybe 4 meters instead of 8, and the light panels had that slightly yellowish tint that meant they'd been running for a decade without replacement. The floor was a textured composite that had been repaired so many times in so many different patches that it looked like a geological survey of some distant planet. Chunks of beige, gray, brown, rust. Some sections had a subtle vibration from the station's rotational mechanics that you stopped noticing after a week, but felt immediately when you first arrived. The corridor smelled like a dozen things at once. Food mostly. The stalls lined both walls of the central walkway, each one run by a different species, or in some cases, a mixed species family that had figured out how to blend menus. There was a Keithrani stall that sold something like deep-fried protein clusters, which smelled incredible despite being violet in color and making a slight hissing sound when they hit the oil. There was a human couple, old, retired station workers, who'd been running a noodle counter for going on 15 years, and the smell of their broth hit you from about 30 meters away. There was a Drellin vendor who sold compressed nutrient spheres that were supposedly the best hangover cure on the station, which I can neither confirm nor deny. There was a place that sold something the menu called atmospheric beverages, which was essentially fancy gas canisters for species that absorbed nutrients through inhalation. And even though I couldn't consume any of it, the smell was like standing in a forest after rain. It was loud, everybody's conversations happening at once, multiple languages being spoken and translated by everyone's individual comm units with a half-second delay, which meant every conversation in the corridor had this slight echo quality, like you were hearing everything twice. Kids running. A Velhari man arguing with a vendor over pricing in a way that seemed heated but was apparently completely normal Velhari social interaction. 2 human maintenance workers eating standing up, leaning against a wall, too tired to sit down properly. Real life. Messy, loud, warm, complicated real life. I liked Level 9, I always had. I came down there after my shift, changed out of my duty armor into civilian station clothes. The garrison allowed that. Off-duty officers could go casual in the non-restricted zones, and I had my ration card in my pocket and exactly 14 station credits left before my next pay cycle, which was 3 days away. 14 credits wasn't much. The noodle counter charged 6 for a full bowl, 4 for a half. I figured I'd get a half bowl, sit down somewhere, stop moving for an hour, and then figure out the rest of the week from there. I was almost at the noodle counter when I saw her. I need to explain what I noticed because it matters. She wasn't causing a scene. She wasn't asking anyone for anything. That was actually the thing that caught my eye because Level 9 was full of noise and motion and interaction, and she was completely still. She was sitting on the floor beside one of the structural support columns, maybe 4 meters from the entrance to the food stall section. Not sitting against the wall like someone resting. Sitting with her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around them, her head slightly down. The posture of someone who'd been there a while and had gotten very practiced at taking up as little space as possible. She was young. I could tell that much immediately, even though she wasn't human, and the physical markers of youth looked different across species. She was Thavari. I recognized the species from the cultural briefings we'd done during induction, though I'd only seen adult Thavari on the station before. Thavari are taller than humans on average, bipedal, with a slightly elongated torso and limbs, and their skin coloring runs from deep amber to copper, with bioluminescent markings along the jaw, forearms, and behind the ears that pulse gently when they're calm and flare brighter when they're agitated or excited. Her coloring was copper amber with darker markings on her forearms that were barely glowing at all. A slow, dim pulse that I'd later learn was what exhaustion looks like on a Thavari. She looked maybe 12 in human years, though I'd later find out she was closer to 15 by Thavari developmental standards, which puts her solidly in adolescent territory by any measure. She was looking at the food stalls. Not with longing, exactly. More with the focused, still attention of someone who'd moved past longing into some quieter place. Like she'd already told herself that wanting wasn't going to help and had arrived at a kind of mechanical observation instead. She was watching the food, cataloging it, the way you look at something that you've decided isn't for you. I'd seen that look before, not on aliens, on people, on kids, on a specific kind of face that's learned to want quietly because wanting loudly doesn't work. I stopped walking. Behind me, someone bumped into my shoulder and muttered something in Velhari that my comm unit translated as moving obstruction, which is basically the alien equivalent of watch where you're going. I stepped to the side, out of the flow of foot traffic, and I looked at her again. She had a small bag next to her, one of those universal design travel packs that you can get at the station commissary, the kind that fits most body types with adjustable straps. It was sitting between her and the column, tucked close. She kept glancing at it occasionally, a quick reassuring look, like she needed to confirm it was still there. I stood there for probably 30 seconds, which doesn't sound like long but feels like a long time when you're just standing still in the middle of a busy corridor making a decision. Here's the thing about the military that civilians don't always understand. You spend a lot of time learning to read situations. You get trained for threat assessment, yes, but threat assessment is really just detailed observation broken down into protocols. You learn to look at a space and understand it quickly. Body language, positioning, context, timeline. What happened here and when and why? What I was reading from that girl was alone, tired, hungry, been here a while. Not in danger, not causing trouble, just very quietly having a hard time. I did a quick mental calculation. Half bowl of noodles, 4 credits. I had 14. If I bought her a full bowl, not a half, that was 6 credits. That left me with 8. I'd been getting by on 8 credits for the last 2 days of a pay cycle before. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't impossible. I walked over to the noodle counter. The woman running it was named Fen Marchetti. She and her husband Gino had been running that counter since before I was stationed on Meridian, and she knew basically every regular face in Level 9, including mine. She was maybe 60, with the kind of hands that come from decades of actual work and the kind of face that had learned to be patient without being passive. She looked up when I got to the front. "Devin, you look terrible." "Long shift," I said. "The usual." "2 fulls," I said. "1 to go, 1 for here." She raised an eyebrow, hungry. "One's not for me." She glanced past me in the direction I'd come from, and I watched her eyes find the girl by the column. Something shifted in her expression, not pity exactly, more like recognition. She'd been running a food stall for 15 years on a transit station. She'd seen the same look before too. She started on the bowls without saying anything else, which I appreciated. Fen wasn't a dramatic person. She did things and the doing was the statement. I paid the 12 credits, tucked the carry container under my arm and walked back toward the column. I want to be honest about this part too. I was slightly nervous. Not about the girl, about getting it wrong. There's a thing that can happen when you try to help someone and you misjudge it, when your help reads as condescension, or assumption, or something unwanted, and I was aware of that. I was also aware that I didn't speak Thavari and was relying entirely on my comm unit's translation, which works reasonably well for formal language but sometimes flattens tone in ways that make simple interactions feel stiff. I walked up to about 2 meters from her and stopped. I didn't crouch down. Crouching can be read as threatening in some species, and I didn't know enough about Thavari body language to risk it. I just stood and waited until she looked up. It took a couple of seconds. When she finally looked up at me, her bioluminescent markings brightened slightly, the automatic startle response, I assumed, and then she just looked at me. Her eyes were a deep amber, the same shade as her skin, very still. "Hi," I said, and my comm unit translated it into what I hoped was a neutral greeting tone. She didn't say anything. I held out the carry container. "I got an extra. I'm not going to be able to finish both. Would you want it?" The comm unit translated. I watched her eyes go from my face to the container and back. The markings on her jaw pulsed twice, a slightly quicker rhythm. "Then why?" Not "why did you get extra?" or "why are you offering it to me?" Just the single word, "why," said in a way that was genuinely asking about motivation, not logistics. I thought about it for a second. I could have said something diplomatic. I could have maintained the fiction about the extra bowl. Instead, I just said, "Because you looked like you hadn't eaten in a while and I had enough to cover it." Another translation delay. She looked at me for a long time. Then she reached out and took the container. I sat down against the wall, not right next to her, a meter or so away, enough space to be non-imposing, and ate my own noodles. She opened the container, and I heard a very quiet sound from her that I can only describe as the sound of relief being suppressed. She ate carefully, not fast, but with a steadiness that told me she was very hungry and managing it. We didn't talk for a few minutes. That was fine. The corridor moved around us. Someone's kids ran past. The Keithrani stall had a brief customer dispute about portion size. An announcement in 4 languages played over the station's PA system about a delayed docking clearance at Bay 14. Eventually she said, "You are garrison." "Off duty," I said. "I'm not here officially." "But you are garrison." "Yeah." She considered this. The garrison at the customs checkpoint told my guardian to wait in secondary processing. That was 6 hours ago. I stopped chewing for a second. "Your guardian is in secondary processing." "Yes, there was a problem with the documentation, a code mismatch on the entry permit. They said it would take 1 hour. She paused. "That was 6 hours ago." I set down my noodle bowl. "And they left you out here." "I am not detained. I do not have a documentation problem. They said I could wait in the corridor." She looked at me with those very still amber eyes. So I waited. I looked at her bag. 1 small travel pack sitting between her and the column. 6 hours alone in level 9. Probably no station credits. The documentation problem would have flagged her guardian's account. No food. No one to ask for help in a place where nobody spoke her language, and nobody had specifically done anything wrong because technically she was fine. She wasn't detained. She was just a kid sitting alone on the floor for 6 hours while a bureaucratic error ground through the system somewhere. I felt something I can only describe as a very particular kind of quiet fury. The kind that doesn't come out loud. It just settles in your chest, and makes you very clear-headed and deliberate. "What's your name?" I asked. "Vethara," she said. "I'm Deven," I said. "Can I ask your guardian, is it family?" "My uncle," she said. "He is the navigator of our family's vessel. The ship is docked in Bay 11. My parents are on the ship. They cannot leave the vessel without a docking clearance that requires my uncle's countersignature." She paused again. "So they are also waiting." A family of aliens stuck in bureaucratic limbo. Guardian in processing. Parents on a ship they legally couldn't leave without paperwork they couldn't complete without the guardian who was stuck in processing. And a 15-year-old kid sitting on the floor in a transit corridor, because technically nobody had done anything wrong. I finished my noodles, stood up. "Are you done eating?" I asked. She looked at the container, then looked at me. "Nearly." "Take your time," I said. "When you're done, I'd like to help you if that's okay. I know some people at the customs checkpoint." Her markings flickered. "Why?" she said again. Same single word, same genuine inquiry. "Same reason as before," I said. I should explain the customs checkpoint situation, because it matters for what happened next, and because it illustrates something real about how Meridian Station worked, and how most things work, really, when you get down to it. Meridian Station processed somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 interspecies transit permits per day. The Customs and Immigration Division ran on a staffing model that had been designed for 1,200, because that was the projected daily traffic when the station was built, and nobody had adequately anticipated how fast it would grow. The result was a system that was genuinely trying, operated by people who were genuinely working hard, running on procedures that had been designed for a station half this size. When something flagged in the system, a code mismatch, an expired certification, a documentation format that didn't match the expected template, it went into a queue. The queue had human reviewers and automated processors and, in theory, was supposed to resolve most flags within an hour. In practice, during peak transit periods, the queue backed up. Cases got pushed. An hour became 3, became 6, we'll process it as soon as we can. Most of the time, the people caught in that process were adults with resources. They had money, contacts, communication devices, places to wait comfortably. They were frustrated and inconvenienced, but they were okay. Sometimes they were people like Vethara's uncle, and sometimes the person waiting in the corridor was 15 years old. The system wasn't malicious. Nobody had decided to leave a kid alone for 6 hours. They'd classified her as undetained minor accompanying an entity under review, and that classification didn't trigger any specific welfare protocols because it had never been specifically anticipated. A gap in the code, not a gap in intent. But the effect was the same. Corporal Tina Solis was working the front desk at the customs checkpoint when I came in with Vethara. Tina and I had done 6 months of overlapping garrison duty, and she was one of the sharper people I'd worked with. She had the gift of reading situations immediately and not wasting time on the wrong response. She looked at me. She looked at Vethara. She looked at the carry container Vethara was still holding. She understood the whole situation in approximately 4 seconds. "Secondary processing issue," she said to me. "Documentation flag, 6 hours pending. The minor's guardian is inside. The family's vessel is docked in Bay 11 and can't clear the dock without the guardian's countersignature." Tina was already pulling up the system. Name of the entity under review. Vethara said her uncle's name, Corvith, of the navigational designation associated with their vessel, which had a registry number I didn't catch, but Tina got it into the system. "Got him," Tina said. "Yeah, flagged for a format mismatch on the intersystem transit continuity certification. It's a paperwork issue, not a compliance issue. His documentation is valid. It's just in the old format and the automated processor didn't recognize it." She typed something, paused, typed something else. I can manually override the flag and push it to expedited review. That'll take about 20 minutes instead of however long it was going to take in the queue. She looked at Vithara. Is that okay? Vithara looked at me first, then at Tina. Yes, she said quietly, thank you. Tina was already processing it. I'm going to send a message to your guardian that the review has been expedited and that you're at the front desk. He can come out when it's cleared. She paused. Do you want to wait here? It's warmer than the corridor. Vithara looked around the small waiting area. It had actual seats, a water dispenser, a screen showing transit announcements. Then she looked at me. Will you also stay? She asked. I sat down. It took 18 minutes. Corvith came out of secondary processing looking like a man who'd spent 6 hours in a bureaucratic holding pattern, which is to say, exhausted, worried, and carrying a very controlled relief. He was tall, taller than me, taller than average Thavari based on the briefings, with the darker copper-amber coloring of an adult and bioluminescent markings that ran all the way up his forearms to the elbow. When he saw Vithara, his markings flared bright, genuinely bright, a warm amber-gold pulse that lasted several seconds before settling. He crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched in front of her, took her hands in both of his and said something rapidly in Thavari that my comm unit translated approximately as, "You are well. I am sorry. You are well. I am sorry. You are well." Vithara said something back. Her uncle looked up at me. The look on his face is hard to describe. I've thought about it a lot since. It wasn't gratitude in the simple sense. It was something more specific than that. It was the look of a person who has spent hours imagining what might have gone wrong and has just been handed evidence that the worst things he imagined didn't happen, and the person standing in front of him is a piece of that evidence. He stood up and looked at me for a moment. Then he said, in careful but clear standard speech, the common language used across most of the Meridian Accords, "You helped her." "She was waiting a long time," I said. "I just made sure she ate and helped move the paperwork." "You are Garrison," he said, not accusatory, more like he was placing me in a context, trying to understand the geometry of what had happened. "Off duty," I said, same as I'd told Vithara, just a person. He looked at me for another moment. Then he said something to Vithara in Thavari and she responded, and he said something else and she nodded. Then he looked back at me. "My name is Corvith," he said, "navigator of the Vetharan Reach, our family vessel." He paused. "We would like to invite you to the ship, this evening if you are available. My brother and his wife will want to thank you themselves." I opened my mouth to say something polite and dismissive, the usual thing, the "I was just doing what anyone would do" response. But Vithara was looking at me. And she said quietly, "Please come." I said yes. Look, I want to be real about what I was thinking in those few seconds of decision. Part of me was thinking about the garrison protocols on accepting invitations from non-allied vessel crews. Technically, I should have flagged it with my unit commander. Technically, there were procedures for this kind of thing. Part of me was thinking about how exhausted I was, and how a bunk and 8 hours of nothing sounded better than anything else on the station. But mostly I was thinking about that girl sitting on the floor with her arms around her knees, looking at the food stalls with that quiet, careful face, and the way she'd said "please come" with the particular tone of someone who meant it. Some things are just simple. They don't need to be complicated. I said yes. Bay 11 was in the lower docking ring, one of the larger berths designed for family-class vessels. Most of the ships in those berths were mid-range intersystem transports, the kind of vessels that independent traders and nomadic families used to move between settled systems. Not luxury ships, not military vessels, but solid, well-maintained craft that represented a family's entire livelihood and life. The Vetharan Reach was that kind of ship, but even in the dim bay lighting I could see it was exceptional. It was bigger than I'd expected. A long, elongated design with what I can only describe as organic curves, like someone had taken a bird in flight and built a starship around the shape of its wings. The hull was a dark, matte composite material I didn't recognize, and it had markings along the aft section that I'd later learn were navigational script, the Thavari tradition of recording a vessel's history directly on its hull. The markings ran in long, elegant lines from the docking clamps all the way up to the forward observation section. I've been on a lot of ships, military vessels, freight haulers, the big commercial liners. The Vetharan Reach was different in a way that hit you before you could articulate it. It felt lived in. Not messy, not worn, lived in. Like a home that happened to be capable of crossing between star systems. Corvith walked us through the docking port, exchanged a brief clearance sequence with the port system, and we went up the access ramp into the ship. The interior stopped me completely for a moment, which Vethara seemed to find slightly amusing. Human ships, civilian or military, have a certain aesthetic. Functional, efficient, ergonomic. Things are where they are because that's where they need to be to work. The design is subordinate to the function always. Thavari ships, or at least this one, were different. The engineering was clearly there. I could see the functional elements, the navigation consoles, the atmospheric processors, the structural elements. But they were integrated into something else entirely. The main corridor we walked through had walls that curved slightly, like the interior of a vessel that had been grown rather than built. The lighting was warm, adjustable, and there were small luminescent accents in the wall material that mirrored the bioluminescent markings of Thavari physiology. So the ship itself seemed to breathe gently, a slow ambient pulse of amber and gold. There were things hung on the walls, not decorations exactly, artifacts, I'd later learn. Objects from different places the family had been, arranged in a way that was more like memory than decoration. A piece of polished stone from a planet I didn't know. A small framed image of something that looked like an ocean, but the water was deep orange. A navigational instrument that was clearly old, probably antique, mounted carefully at eye level. The air smelled like something warm and faintly sweet. Their food, I figured, and also something that might have been the organic materials in the ship's construction. Corvith led us toward the common area, which was the center of the ship, and called out in Thavari as we approached. And then I met the rest of them. The family was larger than I'd expected, and I want to describe this right because it matters. There were 2 adults who came into the common area first. A man, same tall, copper-amber build as Corvith, with markings that were slightly different in pattern, finer lines across the shoulders and upper arms, and a woman with deep amber coloring and bioluminescent marks along her collarbone, and up the sides of her neck that were currently lit in a way that I instinctively read as worried but relieved. These were Vethara's parents, Solon, her father, and Maven, her mother. There were 2 younger children, both obviously Thavari, both much smaller, a boy and a girl who were maybe 8 and 6 by any reasonable estimation. They came in behind the adults and immediately went to Vethara, who crouched and said something to them that seemed reassuring, and then looked at me with a slight expression. I can only describe as my siblings are going to stare at you. I apologize in advance. And then there was an older woman who came in more slowly, from a different section of the ship, who I initially thought was another parent but turned out to be Corvith and Solon's mother, Thavari matriarch, oldest person on the vessel, name of Vethais. She was shorter than the others, with the slightly different proportions that come with age in Thavari physiology, and her bioluminescent markings had a quality I can only describe as depth, like they'd been running for so long they'd acquired a different character. She looked at me for a long moment when she came in, not threatening, very direct. Then she said something in Thavari that Corvith translated as, "This is the garrison soldier who helped Vethara." And she said something else that Corvith translated with a slight pause that suggested he was choosing words carefully, as, "He has a steady face. That is something." I took that as a compliment. I want to tell you about that evening on the ship, and I want to get it right. Because getting it right is the whole point of this account. And getting it right means not making it into something grand or symbolic when it was mostly just very human, or very much like being human anyway. They fed me, that was the first thing. Maven had clearly been cooking since Corvith sent ahead that they were bringing a guest, and the food was, I don't have the right words. It was Thavari food, obviously, some of which I could eat and some of which I probably couldn't, and Solon was very careful to explain each dish and ask before he served me. There was a protein preparation that was similar enough to something I'd describe as braised meat tender, with a complex sauce that had a faint sweetness to it. There were what I can only call vegetable preparations, though the things being prepared were nothing like any vegetable I knew. There was a grain dish. There was a beverage that Solon described carefully as low stimulant, compatible with human chemistry. We verified this, which told me they'd thought about having me over before Corvith had even walked in the door. They'd prepared, not frantically, not in the flustered way of someone scrambling to accommodate an unexpected guest. Deliberately. They'd known Corvith was going to invite me, and they'd gotten ready. I thought about that. We sat around a low table in the common area. The Thavari seating arrangements were different from human chairs, lower and wider, with the suggestion of communal space rather than individual seats. But there was something that worked for me, and Solon had placed it without making a production of it. The two little ones sat across from me and stared openly, which I found endearing rather than rude, because they were clearly too young to manage the social performance of pretending not to stare at something new and interesting. The comm units handled translation, but there was something odd about the conversation that I didn't notice for a while and then noticed clearly when I did. They were all taking slightly longer before they spoke than the translation delay required. They were choosing their words carefully. They were working at this, making it good. Solon asked me about my posting. Not intrusive questions, where are you stationed, how long have you been at Meridian, what does the garrison day look like? Normal questions, getting to know you questions. He asked them the way someone asks questions when they actually want to know the answers, not when they're making conversation noise. I asked about the ship, about where they'd been, where they were going. Corvith lit up when I asked about navigation, literally lit up. His markings brightened, and he started talking about the route they'd been on, a circuit through the outer system belt and back, carrying specialized cargo that I didn't entirely understand, but that had something to do with communication relay components. He'd been a navigator for 20 years, had navigated ships since he was in his mid-20s. He loved it. You could feel that he loved it in the way he talked about it, the specific words he used, the fact that he kept using technical terms and then catching himself and translating them for me. Maven was quieter than the others. She watched a lot, but she asked me, at one point, a question that nobody else had asked. Did you know anything about Thavari before today? A little, I said. Cultural briefings, basic species profiles. The kind of overview that's designed so garrison soldiers don't accidentally cause diplomatic incidents. She smiled at that. A Thavari smile is not exactly a human smile. The mouth moves differently, but the eyes do something similar and the markings respond, a warm brightening. And she said, did the briefings cover what it means to feed someone in our culture? I said I wasn't sure. For us, she said, carefully choosing the words, offering food is an act of recognition. It says, I see that you are a living thing with needs and I am choosing to address those needs. It is not charity in the way your language would mean charity. It is acknowledgement. She paused. Vethara told us what you said to her when you brought the food. That you saw she hadn't eaten and you had enough to cover it. That is exactly the right thing to have said. Exactly. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. In our culture, she continued, someone who does that thing, who sees the need and addresses it without making the person small for having the need, that is a person worth knowing. The little ones, the younger siblings, whose names were Thavel and Kura, lost their shyness after about 40 minutes, which I've found is roughly the universal timeline for small children to decide a new adult is acceptable. Thavel, the boy, had approximately 600 questions about my garrison uniform, which I'd come in civilian clothes but had described. Kura mostly communicated by bringing me things, a small carved object, a piece of what appeared to be decorative metalwork, a drawing she'd made on a screen tablet, and presenting them with a seriousness that suggested she was conducting a comprehensive inventory of interesting things. The older woman, Vethis, sat across from me for most of the evening and watched. She spoke occasionally, and Corvith translated, observations mostly. Once she said something that translated as, "He holds his bowl correctly," which Corvith explained was a compliment about how I was treating the food and the eating, treating it with appropriate attention rather than just consuming it mechanically. Once she said something that translated roughly as, "He doesn't talk to fill the space, he talks to say something," which I think was also a compliment. Vethara sat beside me, not right next to me, the same comfortable distance she'd maintained in the corridor, respectful, but close enough that we could talk without raising voices. She changed out of the clothes she'd had in the corridor into something more comfortable, and her markings were steady and bright in a way that read completely differently from the dim, exhausted pulse I'd seen on level 9. She told me about the ship, not the technical things that was Corvith's territory, but the personal things. The way the hull made a specific sound during certain velocity changes that she'd been hearing her whole life and found comforting. The observation bay at the aft of the ship where you could watch the star field, and the family had a tradition of gathering when they were between systems. The way her father cooked and her uncle navigated and her mother maintained the diplomatic clearances and correspondence for the vessel, because dealing with port authorities and transit bureaucracies was a skill set, and Maven had developed it over years of intersystem travel. "She is very good at documentation," Vethara said, a little dryly. "Usually. Today there was a problem she had not anticipated." "Old format," I said. "Yes." The certification system updated, and we did not realize our documentation was in the previous format. A pause. "We will update it before we leave." "Smart." She looked at me sideways. "Will you be stationed here for a long time?" "Standard rotation is 18 months, I said. "I've got about 14 left." She nodded slowly. "We pass through Meridian approximately every 4 months. The circuit we run brings us back through this system." She paused again. "Perhaps we will see you again." "Maybe," I said. Then she said, in a very careful, precise way, "I am glad you were hungry." I looked at her. "That you went to level 9 because you were hungry," she said. "That you chose the cheap stall. That you were in that specific corridor at that specific time." She was looking at the low table, not at me. "It was not a small thing what you did. I know it seems small, but I had been sitting there for a long time," and she stopped, started again. "My markers had gone very dim. I noticed, which I usually would not notice. It takes a certain kind of tired for me to notice my own markers going dim." She looked up. "You came and they got bright again," she said. "That is not a small thing." I stayed for 3 hours. Not because I was expected to, but because I wanted to, and because nobody made any move to suggest I should go, and because there are very rare evenings in your life when you find yourself somewhere that feels exactly right, and you're smart enough to recognize it in the moment instead of only in retrospect. When I finally said I should head back to the garrison barracks, the whole family came to see me off at the docking port, which I hadn't expected. Solon shook my hand in the human way. He'd clearly researched the gesture. The grip was deliberate and exactly right. Maven gave me something wrapped in a material I didn't recognize and said it was food for the next day, which made my chest do something a little complicated. The little ones waved with an enthusiasm that was completely universal regardless of species. Vethai said something that Corvith translated as, "You are the kind of soldier a station should have." Corvith clasped my forearm in the Thavari greeting and farewell gesture, which I knew from the cultural briefings. A two-handed grip on the forearm, brief, firm, meant to convey that you are known and remembered. His markings were steady bright gold. Vethara walked me to the end of the ramp, stood at the edge of the docking port. "Thank you for the food," she said. "Thank you for the dinner," I said. She almost smiled. That was not the same thing. "I know," I said. "I meant it anyway." She stood at the top of the ramp as I walked down to the bay floor, and I looked back once when I reached the bottom. She raised one hand, a gesture she'd probably picked up from the human crew members on the station, not a Thavari gesture but natural anyway. I raised mine back. I walked back through the docking bay and the transit corridors and the garrison entry checkpoint, and down to my bunk, and I lay there in the dark for a while thinking about not very much. Just the warm amber glow of a family at their dinner table, and the specific sound of small children asking questions in a language I couldn't understand but could follow anyway. I ate the food Maven had packed the next morning. It was the best thing I'd had in months. Supplemental testimony. Station Security Archive 7714C. Witness, Corporal Tina Solis, Customs and Immigration Division, Meridian Station. Look, I want to be clear that processing the flag was not a big deal. It was a legitimate documentation error that we could have resolved much faster if the queue hadn't backed up, and honestly it was my fault too for not catching it earlier in the shift. When Devin came in with the kid, I pulled the case and resolved it in 20 minutes. That's not a heroic act, that's my job. But I'll tell you what did stick with me. He came off a 14-hour shift. I know because I saw the duty log. We're a small enough garrison that I know the scheduling. He came off 14 hours, went to get food in level 9 because that's where the affordable stuff is, and then instead of just going to his bunk, he spent his evening helping a family he didn't know navigate our bureaucratic backlog. And then he never mentioned it to anyone. Not his unit commander, not in the duty log, nowhere. I only know about it because Maven, the mother from the ship, sent a formal commendation to the garrison command 3 days later, and it worked its way back to me because I was the one who'd processed the flag, and then I went and asked Devin about it. He shrugged. He said he'd had a good evening and left it at that. I've worked the customs checkpoint for 4 years. I processed 200 to 300 transit cases on a standard shift. Most of what I see is people at their worst, stressed, tired, often scared, moving between systems with everything they own and dealing with a bureaucracy that doesn't always make it easy. You see some bad things. You also occasionally see something good. What I saw was a guy who paid for a kid's dinner because she was hungry, and then stayed and made sure the problem got fixed, and went home and didn't tell anyone about it. That's a small thing, I know. But I'll tell you, in 4 years at this checkpoint, that small thing was not as common as it should have been. Station Log Supplemental, Documentary Archive Continuation. Date, March 15-17, 2341 CA. Compiled from Garrison Communications, Diplomatic Correspondence, and Interview Records. The commendation sent by Maven of the Veteran Reach to Meridian Station Garrison Command on March 17, 2341 CE read, in part, as follows, translated from Thavari Standard Diplomatic Form. We wish to formally acknowledge the actions of a garrison soldier, Corporal Devin Ashworth, who on the evening of March 14th encountered our daughter Vethara during a period of difficulty and provided material assistance and personal kindness without being asked, without benefit to himself, and without expectation of recognition. He also facilitated the expedited resolution of a documentation matter that had kept our family separated for an extended period. We understand that soldiers are posted to stations like Meridian to provide security and maintain order. We have found, in our transit experiences across many stations and many systems, that this function is sometimes performed with a kind of cold efficiency that serves its purpose, but does not serve the spirit of interspecies cooperation that makes places like Meridian possible. Corporal Ashworth performed his function on his time off, with a warmth and a directness that reminded us why such cooperation is worth the effort. We are grateful. The commendation was entered into the garrison record. Corporal Ashworth was reportedly embarrassed by it and asked that it not be read aloud at the unit briefing. It was read aloud anyway. His unit found this very funny. He did not. Final supplemental personal account, Corporal Devin Ashworth. Date of interview, September 23, 41 CE, 6 months after the events described. They came back through in July. 4 months, like she said. I got a message through the station comm system 3 days before they arrived from Vethara, which I hadn't expected. She said they'd be docking in Bay 11 again, and that her mother wanted to know if I'd be available for dinner. I put in for an off-duty evening and went back to the ship. Same docking bay, same ramp. But the hull had new markings. Corvith explained that they'd added to the navigational history script, recorded the passage through the outer system corridor and back. The markings go all the way up the aft section now. Same family. Thavel had learned about 12 words in standard speech and used approximately 11 of them on me within the first 5 minutes. Kura had made something, a drawing, kind of, or a model, I couldn't tell which, that she presented to me in the same serious inventory way she'd done before. Vethais looked at me for a long time when I came in, same as before, and then said something that Corvith translated as, "He came back. That confirms it." I asked Corvith what it confirmed. He said that you are worth knowing. We had dinner. They told me about the route, about a system they'd passed through that had an unusual atmospheric phenomenon that Vethara had described in what sounded like genuinely scientific detail. Maven had a question about a human cultural thing she'd encountered in transit documentation, and we spent 20 minutes on that. Solon had a question about the garrison structure, and I tried to explain the chain of command, which is harder to explain than it sounds. Vethara sat beside me again, same distance, markers steady and bright. Near the end of the evening, she said to me, very casually, like it wasn't a significant thing, "We have been talking about this route, the outer circuit. It takes us through 3 systems and back in approximately 4 months, and we have done it for 11 years, and we will probably do it for many more years." She paused. "You said your rotation here is 14 months total." I said yes. She said, "That is 3 more visits before your rotation ends." I looked at her. She was looking at the table, with the particular look of someone who has said the thing they meant to say, and is now waiting to see if it lands. I said, "I'll be here." She looked up. Her markers did that thing, the warm, bright flare that I'd learned by then meant genuine response, not just startle. She nodded once. 3 more visits, I repeated. "I'll make sure I'm off duty." She said, "You do not have to be off duty. You are garrison, you help people." We are people, this is compatible. I couldn't really argue with that. I walked back to the garrison barracks that night thinking about something my father used to say when I was a kid. This idea that the most important things that happen to you don't announce themselves. They come in ordinary moments. You're tired and hungry and you go looking for cheap noodles, and something turns, and years later you understand that the turn was the thing. I don't know how to put it better than that. I was hungry, a kid was hungry, I had enough to cover it. Sometimes that's all it takes to begin something real.